Uh, I'm Richard Kessler. I'm not here to talk about myself, but to talk about Sam Patten. And Sam Patten talked about himself, and you all asked questions. Sam's written a very interesting book. He and I have talked a little bit about how to approach it, the discussion, and we're going to start out with a little bit of, he's going to give us a little bit of historical context and to fill out some of the blanks in this book. Sam, you want to stand or sit? We can sit down.
Yeah, it's going to take a while, so. First of all, thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many viewers and friends, and thank you, Rick, for facilitating this discussion. Thank you, Elizabeth, for hosting it. This room is where I wrote the book that we're discussing. Basically, in that corner there, and sometimes in that corner there. So. Yeah, it's a familiar place, and it's a great place to talk about the book. The Patten Free Library is no relation to me, even though my last name is Patten, but I pretend, and it's nice to, visit a building, work in a building that has your name on the board. I grew up in Knox County, which is not far from here, a little ways down east of Hayward. My book begins and ends in Maine, and I think Maine is sort of, because we're in Maine, but it's also, an important grounding area of the book. Maine is where I started working in political campaigns. At the beginning of my career, I worked at the Camden Herald, which is, I don't know if it still exists, but it was a newspaper in Camden, Maine. And I went back and worked at the same paper again. Years ago, I think now it's a little bit very strong to it.
Yeah, a little Camden Herald comes out.
Yeah.
But it's stuck in the Courier. They're all one paper.
I forgot to mention my high school English teacher was. So, there's something about Maine, I think, that maybe it's the shipbuilding heritage and the captains who would seek our captains, throughout the 19th century, who would come from Maine or around the world and come back to Maine. I think this is a state that's a little more worldly than other states in the country, maybe because it's the first place the sun hits every morning. Maybe there are a lot of reasons it could be. But I find Mainers tend to be, and you notice this when you drive around the state, 1 out of every 2 license plates is a veteran plate. So I think we have one of the highest per capita numbers of veterans in the country. So that speaks to sort of, again, the worldliness of Maine people. Still, when I was young, I couldn't wait to get out and to get out of Maine and get to the bigger world where things were happening. And initially that was Washington, D.C., because city I also knew somewhat well because my grandparents were long times Washington figures. And when I wasn't in Maine, I would be visiting them, and there's a social circle in Georgetown, which included a lot of the very top people in American political and cultural life. So that was kind of another, that was an attractive role to me to go and see how the world works. And after a brief period there, I wound up going overseas. And I worked overseas. I think we'll get into this a little bit more on just about every continent, on every inhabited continent, as a political consultant, first as an activist, later as a political consultant and political tourist. And that's what a lot of this book is about. Trying to think, I was, yeah.
Let me interrupt a little bit, Sam.
Yeah.
Tell me, did you have, when you were in college, where were you in college and what did you major in? International? Was it political?
Yeah, it was that drew me to Washington. I went to Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I studied international relations, and the world was changing there. I took one course on Soviet foreign policy that was in the political science department. One semester, the second semester was in the history department. So they shifted faculty head of enforcement security and defense issues in the eighties during the First Gulf War. So the professor was there a lot of three classes because he was on some television show, sharing his expertise about the Middle East and defense issues of the world. So it was a time to see the world beginning to change. The Berlin Wall came down. It was an exciting time to sort of start looking out of the world. But to give an example, just one more example of Maine in the world, the first country I went to work in was Kazakhstan, exactly on the other side of the globe here. And I met Richard Lugar there, the senator from Indiana, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was very active in denuclearization, particularly the Nevada Semi-Politics project and other projects that followed from that, none of which were they provided funds for defense conversion, moving from nuclear to industrial use of nuclear energy. And I introduced myself as coming from Maine, and his eyes sort of watered a bit. He got misty-eyed. The reason was because Maine was the only state that he won. He ran for he won the office to that, didn't win the nomination. And that sort of
That's a factor about Richard Lugar, I don't know, but that big work behind him, I suppose.
And Rick has worked on the Hill, I would say up until, I had a very brief period on the Hill, but you worked on the Hill until about 10 years ago?
Yeah, 2014 I retired, but which provokes me to ask you, how did you get, your book really gets into a lot more detail about your family and your political activities that you sort of allude to in your talk. So it's very interesting. But what sort of got you involved in politics? And were you working for, I know you started out working for Susan Collins. Did you do so from Maine or from Washington?
I was working as a reporter for the Camden Herald, and actually I was a subject of Maine Media Watch on Maine Public Radio with Al Don and Mal Leary and various other people, because I worked I had a day job as a reporter, and I took my first political job as a press secretary for a guy who went to Congress, but he wasn't paid. So I kept the reporter's job, and Maine Media Watch had some issues with this, and they dedicated a segment to it. But that was he didn't win the final. And that was my first political job in Maine. Then I found Susan Collins walked in the door of our newspaper, and I was running onto a fire somewhere at the time. I didn't sort of focus on her at first, because when she was running for governor, I think there were 8 or 10 Republicans running for governor. She was one of 8 or 10, and then she won the primary, and I started paying a lot more attention and ended up working for her as her deputy press secretary, because there was no press secretary. I was only 21, and she didn't think a 21-year-old would be press secretary. So that was my title. She came to government in 1994. We lost to Angus Kim, and she ran again in 1996. And between these two campaigns, I went to Kazakhstan. That 1994 campaign was bruising enough, and it was unfair, and what did she lose? I just focused on other countries. And I remember I had a friend who worked in the Blaine House, who had worked for Angus King, and he sent me a note about Bill Cohen resigning. He had just seen it in a wire, and this is before the internet was really big. Not everybody was writing a wire all the time. And it was evening in Kazakhstan, and I had a few drinks, and I was in sort of a philosophical mood. So I sent Susan a note saying, you should really run, you should run for Senate. And if you do, I'll move back there. And I wasn't being serious because I didn't really think she'd run, and I'd been drinking. And she politely wrote me a note back within like an hour or so saying, thanks so much, but I don't think I'm going to do it. And I said, you forgot about it, and went on with my life for 2 weeks. She changed her mind. So that was 1996.
So how do you get from a failed gubernatorial campaign to Kazakhstan? Sort of a big leap there.
It was on the other side of the. And
that's true, but
I was looking to go to the other side. And I've been dating somebody whose father was a lawyer because of government in these early world negotiations. In the early 90s, when Kazakhstan was opening up as opposed to the country on its own, they surprised Sheffield and the big majors by having their own right shooting and their own lawyers in the negotiating to make sure they got the best deal. And my girlfriend at Tom's father was a lawyer, and I think he wasn't trying to get rid of me, but I think he wanted me to make enough money to marry his daughter that was father. But he helped me get to Kazakhstan and found a place where I could work there, and it was the perfect time to be there because the country was just being born.
And you give a lot more vignettes about your time working for Sue Collins that I sort of appreciated. One comment you got is you later went back to work for Sue in the Senate, right?
I did. I worked for, when I went to Kazakhstan, I got married, I had a child, and started to think maybe it's a good time to come back to the States. And so I worked for her initially in Portland, and then she gave me as a human slave to the George W. Bush campaign when he was running for president. I had raised the money for her to get elected in 1996, and she was one of the few politicians who had a surplus. Usually politicians end a campaign debt, and she had a surplus, and Carl Rove was looking at all the money out there, and he saw she had this surplus, so he called her up and said, "Do you think you could make a transfer for the campaign and be a good Republican?" And she said, "I'm not a rich senator like so many others, I can send you a slave," and that was me.
Sounds like this in Collins, I know so well. And at one point in your book, you mentioned that you were later told that you wouldn't make a good Senate staffer, and as having been a Senate staffer myself, I'm curious as to what the why there was that conclusion.
Might have had something to do with discipline. I thought it was Sue because he told me that. And I think that he recognized.
He was his chief of staff, right?
He was Bill Cohen's chief of staff.
Bill
He'd never been her chief of staff. He was her boyfriend, later husband. And it was his observation. And, Tom had been the senator from Illinois, Percy. He'd been Charles Percy's. Yeah, I mean, he was a preacher of the Hill. He'd been on the Hill forever.
Right.
And I think he just saw that my characteristics, who knows? My time on the Hill was brief. I wound up going overseas because I would try and hide from my desks sometimes. When you're a Senate staffer, you work in committees. Personal staff is a little different.
Right.
Personal staff is much more focused on the senator as opposed to the committee work, which is more legislative. But I would look for any excuse to escape from my cubicle. You'd have a cubicle with C-SPAN, and C-SPAN showed the floor, and you'd sit at the cubicle waiting for the senator to call, and that was your life. And so I was always looking for some place to go and hide. And the Senate barber shop, and I write about this in the book, had a shoe shines. So I get my shoe shine, and I was sitting waiting to get my shoe shine, and there were two guys ahead of me in line, and they were talking about democracy building in Mongolia. And I had lived in Kazakhstan, and so I knew where Mongolia was, and I was actively eavesdropping and thinking, who the hell does that? Who builds democracy? So I interrupted eventually and said, who are you? What are you talking about? U.S. government funds democracy programs. One is Paul Grove, was one of the staffers, who was an appropriation staffer in the Foreign Office. And so he knew about the funding and the funds for democracy programs. And I started researching that. After that, I called the International Republican, there's an International Republican Institute, and there's a National Democratic Institute. And I called the Eurasia director for the Republican Institute, and wound up being their Russia country director before too long. So I escaped from there. I might have, if I'd stayed there, I would have gotten in this trouble.
Well, a little bit later in the talk, I'd like you to get into a discussion about what it is like working in democracy programs and then working on lobbying work and political work. But first, I thought it'd be interesting for people to hear about how what your writing process was. And I was struck that during COVID, 3 or 4 of the people I know wrote their autobiographies. And I thought it was sort of interesting that so many did. And I wondered what your writing process was. How do you decide what to write about? Especially when you've had a varied life. How do you research it? I think you would quote people sometimes directly. How do you keep those quotes? I'm always embarrassed that I can't remember anything anybody ever said to me. How do you organize the facts? And how do you, what's your schedule? What do you really, how do you do it? I know some people are famous for, getting up in the morning and working for 3 hours and then sending the kids to school. You always read about this, and I just wondered how you did it.
That's a great question, and when we get to a reading, I'm gonna mention something to that effect, but I think the first thing to think about is just the time involved. And when I think about this book, the first recorded evidence that I was writing a book that I found was in 2014. So it's almost been 10 years in the making. I've been working on it in earnest for about 4.5 years. So, that's the scope of time that it takes to work on the book. In terms of getting your subject, that was challenging for me too. It's so many aspects of it were challenging, and I'm sort of jumping all over the place, but I sent an early proposal, to an agent, who's the agent for Victor Davis Hanson and some other sort of arch conservatives. And the response that he sent me back was, and this was before the Mary Trump book came out, too much and not enough. And that was the title of Trump. Maybe he had heard that title was in the works. I don't know. It sort of stung at the time, too much and not enough. But it also helped my thinking, because you do have to come up with a frame of what exactly is it? How can I tell a story in a certain amount of space? And how much can I fit in there? And how much do I need to fit in there? And how much of this is for me and how much of it is for the reader? And it starts out being about for you, you're sort of working out the cathartic process. But if it's too cathartic, it's not going to be interesting to the reader. So you have to always consider the audience. What is the audience's appetite, their interest?
Did you start out setting a goal of yourself of 300 pages or 250 or 500? Did you end up with a lot and then have to cut it back?
It was about time. I would ask friends who have written books about word counts, because that's a concrete, what does a book look like? What is the word count? It could be 70 to 150,000 words. So that, if you're thinking about it that way, and that helps you structure, but still just getting the subject down, I think is harder first. And how do you edit yourself? And how do you decide what's important to people? And it just took trial and error. And coming up, chapters would fall out of the book, other chapters would come in, but you're winnowing down, and you're rewriting all the time. And yes, early in the morning, I find everybody's different. Some people are night owls, but I find it's easiest early in the morning.
And did you start out with an outline, or did you have a target for the size of the chapters, or how did you do that too?
Notionally, I had a target just by doing the math. If the book is going to be 100,000 words, you shooting for 10 chapters, that would be 10,000 words a chapter. That's a big chapter. So when you look at other, a chapter I think is usually about 5,000 to 7,000 words. That was sort of the target that I had, and I would overwrite. So if my target was 5,000 to 7,000 words, I wrote about 12,000 to 15,000. And then go back and cut it this time.
Did you work with the word processor or pen or pen?
Everything.
I don't know how to do it. And did you use a particular program? Was there some?
Just words, just words. It's very important to say it. Say it all the time. Nothing worse. Writing a few thousand words.
And how much what was your first draft? How long was your first draft? And then how long
I think probably a factor of, a good example would be there was a Rolling Stone ran an episode of the chapter. And the editor told me 3,000 words, and the chapter was 8,000. So getting 8,000 down to 3,000, this involved a lot of cutting. And it's actually easier to cut. I mean, at first you think, oh, these are my children, but when you step back and you say, okay, this doesn't need to be, if you overwrite, it's easier to cut. If you underwrite, you can't get rid of this. Then what will be? So it's always better to overwrite. And then.
And did the chapter that you finally put in the book, was it Rolling Stone period?
Well, this was after the book was published. So I took the chapter as published.
And then set back. And you have a lot of personal stuff in your book. I should maybe, I don't know if it's warning people or encouraging them.
And also to keep the reader interested, and you know, it's a common part of our lives.
Right.
It's how we often come together. So there's a fair amount of sex. But I think the drinking is in the way.
So buy it.
I'll take 5 copies.
Well,
You were saying,
the drinking is, the drinking has a lot to do with the story. Because for me, and I don't drink anymore, but when I did drink, alcohol would lend false bravado and courage. So, you know, the first time I went to Baghdad, I was drunk, and I went sober later, many years later, and it was different. Yeah, there's a fair amount, particularly in the middle section of this book, sort of bravado and you know, taking chances and doing risky things, and as the title says, you know, hanging out with dangerous something. And these are decisions that are easier than in the grasp of alcohol and each other. Now, does that mean that if I have, you know, sober people shouldn't consider a life overseas? No, but it's certainly, it's a factor in the observation, and it's a factor in the actions that occur.
Well, I think your book is, I won't say, it's not confessional, it's more evolutionary. I mean, you see yourself, at least I see yourself evolving as a person and dealing with issues, and becoming somebody different than when you started out. Do you see it that way?
I do. Today is the launch day for the McKay Coffins book on Nick Ron called, and the title of the book is The Reckoning. And he was, the author was lamenting in Facebook, is my book even relevant? He's a Mormon, so I thought that was an interesting frame. Obviously, it came out to the book, but the idea of reckoning, I mean, our country is going through a wreck. So the third part of my book, the first part of the book is about idealism. The second part of the book is about sort of mercenary done. And the third part is about my reckoning coincides with the reckoning that's going on there's in the country. So there's a parallel to that. And yeah, I think that my personal evolution, which I share in the book, is important to the story itself. Because it begins, it's circular, in a way, it begins and ends.
It's fairly,
With a few things picked up.
it's pretty fair. If we could just discuss a little bit about your career, and you mentioned how you got involved in Kazakhstan. You worked a lot in democracy programs, and as you mentioned, there's the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute. There's also an equivalent in the labor organization. The CIO runs one, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has one. There's a long sort of history of evolving out of the nationally dominant democracy and making something politically civil on both sides. So everybody gets a piece of the action. But I'm fairly familiar with all of them because we used to authorize their funding. But could you talk a little bit about going into democracy programs and IRI and NDI both do similar stuff in similar countries. What did you learn from that experience?
I came out this.
I mean, after I started out in Russia.
Yeah.
And probably one can say that a lot of our democracy programs start out in countries. And they don't work out, as we see now in Russia.
Well, yeah, the second chapter of this book was about Russia and that experience. And I went to Russia in 2000. The Reagan Council, which created these institutes, was 1984, so it was all still relatively young. In 1984, Congress dedicated money to promoting democracy through a foundation of what $100 million. I mean, it's not a huge amount of money. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars increased that. Yeah, you know, when I went to Russia, it was with the hope that, you know, like a Peace Corps volunteer. I don't know if anyone's been a Peace Corps volunteer, but it's sort of like a political version of that. You go to this country with these great expectations that you can help usher in change and transform and teach them a better way of doing things. And the work's been criticized by other countries as arrogant. I know it's been an issue in the last several presidential novels. I can think specifically Barack Obama's and Donald Trump's novels both talk about how America engages with the rest of the world. I think Obama said something about unclench your fist and open out a hand. Trump's was more, we're not going to lecture you on how we should be as a country. And George W. Bush had run for president, promising a more modest America, and then launching us into two of the longest running wars that we've ever had. Yeah, so when I showed up in Russia, democracy work was still somewhat new on me, but I had been going around since the fall of the end of communism. And Russia had a bumpy course of democracy. Democracy had not worked in the first few years. And some of the trends that we see now, corruption, massive corruption, and that created the ground for Vladimir Putin and his governments. The people craved for it, and they wanted an end to all the chaos, all the different, all the theft, and they wanted a strong man to come and fix things. So the appetite and tolerance for democracy, Russians, from 1991 until 2001, made Russians very simple. And it was hard for me as a peddler of democracy not to end up being a bit cynical myself.
And what did you actually tell? I mean, people don't. You can elaborate a little bit on what the programs and the projects you were and what you funded and that sort of thing.
Where the rubber hits the road is really in what the party institutes can do is campaign and teach political parties in their countries how our political parties operate and are organized. Because in most of these countries, at least where I live, the major party have been the communists. And the Communist Party was a unitary party with competition. So when people thought party, they just thought the state being overlaid on party of the state. So building political parties, waging elections, we also had a parliamentary program. And when I first arrived in Russia, we just published a book, my predecessor, the Ordinance, on how to be a better parliamentary, how to be a better legislative staff for the state, the Russian state, which is why they Congress. So we printed up about 2,000 copies and sent them to all the offices so that every staff could have a copy of our handbook and be so helpful. There were 450 members of the state movement at that time. I only got one thank you, and it was from Vladimir Zhirinovsky. And he said, thank you, all, you know, sanctimonious American, for teaching us primitive arguments about democracy. We will come down from the period of the almost signed. So at least somebody appreciated it. I don't want to be too cynical because these programs over time not have great effect, particularly in Central and Eastern European countries and other countries. The Middle East. I went from Russia to Iraq after the invasion in 2004, as Iraq was preparing for its first major election in 50 years. They have had elections in which male shapes were better in the past, but this was the first sort of modern election in the United States. And it interestingly enough, I found much more hopefulness about democracy in Iraq than they did in Russia.
Why was that?
My Russian friends made jokes about, how they're not going to be interested because it was popular laws, because they were starting out and they were willing to give it a shot. They hadn't had that 10-year period of corruption and chaos. And frankly, they were great, liberated. So they were willing to give it a shot. And the idea of self-determination. Also, Iraq is one of the more developed of the other countries. So, when you're thinking of a country that's going to adopt democracy sooner, there's sort of a hope. I mean, wag the tail, you would say, we thought there were weapons of destruction, we invaded, and with the pretext to cover that, so we came up with a democracy. That is one solution. But the Bush administration made democracy promotion part of the national security goal, which I don't know if it was in 1968 that Paul Nitze had written, in terms of the West versus the free world, the capitalistic world versus the Soviet Union, but there hadn't been another example since the fall of the Soviet Union. So the idea that democracy promotion was the policy of the United States made it seem much more patriotic.
How long were you in Iraq?
I was in Iraq for a year. I was in Iraq initially for a year, and then I went back and worked with Patten and Kurdistan, which is technically very 16 years.
And how did it go in Kurdistan?
Well, Kurdistan is, I would say, long for I think the Kurds deserve their freedom, and everyone's to take them, we will take them. And I hope eventually they'll get there because they should be. They certainly need it.
And did you continue with the democracy, IRI, after the stand?
That was where things changed. I mentioned sort of becoming a little bit more cynical in Russia. After the Iraq experience, I became much more, as we could imagine.
What was it? You said that the Iraqis were more open and more.
The situation deteriorated. That comes again in the book, that, in 2013 and 2014, but because of systemic problems that we didn't address in 2004 and 2005, and that was really Sunni engagement. You have to engage them, and we need to do it enough. Our coalition provisional government stupidly created a deep application rule that made anyone who had served in that party before disqualified from any government post. And then they fired everybody with that beyond completely off without giving them new jobs. That was a false Paul Brown, although Charlie was responsible for the deep application. And we see this in the country. It's a Latin word, lustration. And it's a desire to punish the past regime. The Poles that struggle with lustration, a lot of Eastern European countries that struggle with it. You ban people who you consider implicit in a bad regime from ever taking part in civic life again. And if you do that, what do you do in society? It's a very radical process. It's just as in our own political system, where we've become more polarized in this country on both sides. It's a way in which other countries around the world also have a more extreme point towards.
And so after Kurdistan, you moved away from democracy.
Well, I'd like to say I moved away and stayed in parallel, because one of my disillusionments was that, we're talking about relatively small amounts of money. We're talking about democracy promotion. It's really seed time to get out there and get people interested. But it's not enough money to tip the scale. You have to get the people in these countries to put their own money on the table. And until they do, they'll just smile and nod and take the check. But when they start co-investing, And when they start spending the money, we started this in Russia, Boris Nemtsov, who was later assassinated. They were paying for 50% of the program that I created, which indicated that they cared. So when I became a mercenary, political consultant, working for people for money, if they were paying, they're going to pay more attention to my advice because they're paying, as opposed to some random NGO guy who blows through town and gets a quiz sheet on best practice. So if they have skin in the game, they're going to be more interested. And that really is my justification for moving into what I call mercenary, but front political consulting performance.
When you started out looking for,
The Kurds actually were my first fund.
oh, they were,
The KDP, which is one of the two major political parties in Kurdistan, helping them modernize their operation. All of their posters looked a little bit like Saddam Hussein, middle-aged guys with good statues. And so we had to work to kind of like create train a new research team and come up with new ways of doing research, organizing. And there's change in Kurdistan, third-party innovation. It's becoming slightly less authoritarian.
were you working on your own there, or were you working for another group?
Even though I am, we'll get to this later, convicted of a lobbying crime, I've never really been a lobbyist. I've registered more times than we haven't registered, but I haven't, that was out of an abundance of caution because of
I mean,
lobbying.
I mean, I'll be clear, the whole issue of American consultants going to help clients in other countries do campaign work has been established. Actually, I think it was probably Democratic lobbyists that
Alpha, so it was the Smith, that's
put us back in the old way.
back in the late 70s.
Yep. So I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just, are you working?
But I would work through lobbies. I would work through lobbies. So large lobbying firms.
Yeah.
Barbara Griffith and Rogers.
Okay. Haley Barton.
So Haley Barber was a legendary former chairman of the Republican National Committee.
Building her,
And later governor of Mississippi during Hurricane Katrina. Mississippi is the only state that did well.
I'll have to admit, I had Haley Barber in front of my committee at one point trying to justify the money that was missing in Mississippi over the hurricane, but anyway. Run along.
Now Barbara Griffith and Rogers is one of the major Republican firms,
Yeah.
and there are several big firms. They change over time. Patten bought some clothes during the time.
And if you were, I mean, if the audience here is full of younger people wanting to start a career, and they were interested in working for that type of business, what would you recommend? What would you tell them in terms of the type of work you do, what experiences you need to do it well?
When I was a cooperating witness in Boston for the special counsel, sometimes in between sort of long interrogation sessions, I go get a haircut. And I had a haircut at a place in downtown Washington, and there was a guy getting shaved. He was being shaved. He's obviously models, because everyone knows models. And the barber who was shaving said, "Oh, have you always known models?" And the guy started to chortle, but if he chortled too much, he would have. So I think anybody goes up wanting to be a lobbyist. Washington people actually do for a lot. I would urge anyone, there's plenty of it.
I have to admit, I never thought about it in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, I know plenty of people that did, so it's
Yeah.
a fairly big profession.
Yeah, I think most lobbyists are people who have served in government at some point in time. So, if you focus on serving in government first and you have expertise and stuff like that, then that's something you can learn better. But to be a lobbyist for its own sake, what are we going to do in this country when it comes to special interests? I just think a lot is going to be changing. And lobbying is a sort of a quasi-legal operation.
After all, we had a referendum in November and May.
About foreign interests
Right.
and their ability to participate in elections, which shockingly there is a loophole for that. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So you went from, after Kyrgyzstan, you went to
The first,
Congo?
I went to, after Kyrgyzstan, I think I went to, I don't like it.
Oh, you don't?
But I went to Thailand to work for Patten, who was the prime minister of Thailand. And this was all,
Sort of back in the power in a way.
well, he got his sister left.
Yeah.
And,
Back in the power.
but the royal regime in Bangkok doesn't want this side. And he's a Sino man of students. He's an ex-policeman who became a telecommunications
Billionaire.
billionaire eventually. And he sold a large telecommunications company in Singapore, which became a billion in process and made a lot of people angry. But he was a brilliant politician who continued winning elections in Thailand. So they had to figure out the Thais always had coups. They had 17, 40 coups is his memory. And eventually he was toppled by it too. And it made me wonder how useful my advice was, because I remember Bob Blackwell, who you probably know, who he's been ambassador to India, he's been deputy in the
Not one of my favorite people.
not most people don't like Bob Blackwell, but the guy I worked for sort of purchased him after Condi threw around. And Bob Blackwell sat in the room with Dr. Chinawatra and my boss and said, Mr. Prime Minister, if you don't come to New York for the UN General Assembly in September, there's nothing we can do. And he was under a lot of pressure from Trump. He was about to be in the front. And he looked around the room, and he looked at my boss, and he looked at me, and he said, really? No. And so he did. So he made the company, he set up the political problems in Thailand. He went to the UN General Assembly, and while he was giving his speech in New York, the general said, go. And they had to do it. So it was the most useless advice, I think, that anybody's ever paid for.
Very well. I'm glad. And it's very interesting because Thaksin really was a populist. I mean, he won a popular.
He won because he transformed the economy after the crash in the late 90s and after the Asian flu. Thailand was the first country to start standing up again. And they did it through microloans, they did it through economic empowerment of people in the north and small farmers, and it's the healthcare system. And they did a number of things quite quickly. And that made them popular.
And after Thailand, why didn't you talk about Thailand in the book?
So because again, this goes back to what fits, and if there are too many things, I mean, there's a consistent theme of the former Soviet Union. It's where I start out in sort of to getting crucified, and there's a little bit of the Middle East, and a touch, maybe a touch of Africa flavor, but you can't have too much. Even now, it's almost too. You constantly have to narrow the framing and narrow the focus. And Thailand is to really fit within the trends.
And so from Thailand, you went to.
The first place I write about in this book in chapter 5 is Georgia. And Georgia is one of those countries that are meaningful to me because I've worked both multiples. And I think in a way it's the only way, having initially done this work, you go to a country as a consultant, you think, okay, my guy is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they're going to change this country because I'm working. And that makes them extraordinary. That means they're the greatest. But then when you go back and you work for the others, you learn everything the state does. And it gives you sort of a deeper complexity in your country. And Georgia, I went to Georgia, actually the Democrats from Greenberg, Clinton, Ross, Virginia, Bill Clinton's from. And they thought he was a token Republican because the client was a guy named Mikhail Saakashvili, who considered himself a conservative, center-left sort of guy. And we helped him win an election. He had gotten into some trouble by being a little bit too authoritarian. So there were snap elections, and he won that election eventually. And then I left Georgia, and then there was a war, the Russians. And there were little things that struck me as odd while I was there that only came back to me in the face of an actual invasion. But Saakashvili was partially responsible for that invasion. I'm not saying, I think our line is that, yes, it was Russian aggression, but he poked the bear. And you don't poke the bear, you don't poke the bear when you don't have the resources to fight it. he assumed the United States would come to his defense, which is nobody told him the United States would come to his defense. He just assumed that, you know, the ship hit the fan, so to speak, that the Americans would support him. And I remember seeing that conflict. I was working at the State Department at the time, and I worked one night in the ops center, the overnight watch, and it was, you know, there was very little we could do. We were fighting two wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were stretched as much as possible, so we were basically pulling the trick. We were reflagging old Coast Guard frigates and running them through the Bosphorus, so the Russians would think that the American Navy was. And that was when the charge to Tbilisi stopped. The Russian tanks could have taken Tbilisi, and because of their short range programs, the American warship could fall backward when the Russians stopped. And I think that gave a moment of pause, and then negotiations. But Misha's behavior, Socrates' behavior, is partially the blame for that. And I went back to work against him later, and we actually defeated him and got him out of power. He didn't win.
And that was the situation with Jordan.
Well, he fled the country after he lost the election. And he went back, even though charges were brought against him for abuse of power, and he's in jail. He's in prison.
What do you think of the situation?
I think it's challenge. I think it's challenged, but I also think that there hasn't. Again, this is an emerging democracy. A strong counterforce hasn't been built yet. And Georgia's a funny little country. There's only 4 million people. So the attention to the West go a lot further. And Shevardnadze has been very pro-Western. And the Georgians are Europeans, essentially. They're kind of like Italians without the smooth edges. They're very poetic. They're very, it's a wine drinking country as opposed to most of the because they're grapes versus grain.
Wine is supposed to be originated.
And they take credit for the creation of wine, and it's where the golden fleece was. But that all of that doesn't help democracy,
Right.
necessarily. And they have yet to really get into the system of having 2 strong counterparts. Right now, the Georgian dream is the governing party is owned by the countries which are smooth, and it has not been as pluralistic as it has.
I think that's fair. You promised you will read some excerpts from your book, but before that, you've alluded to it, so it might be good for the audience to hear a little bit about your lobbying conviction. What your take is on that?
Yeah. So this is the end of my forum, and my last forum for my long forum was in Ukraine, which is back in the US now. I had worked on multiple sides of Ukraine, so I have in Georgia, and I went back in 2014 to work for a party called the Opposition Bloc, which was the real underdog. They had a revolution. President Yanukovych had been overthrown and fled the country and went to the outside. And there was a beginning. Some of the people who grew richest with him left and went to Russia, and the ones who didn't, who stayed behind, those were the ones who were called pro-Russian, which I object to. I think that that's sort of a misunderstanding of Ukraine that's been going on since the invasion. I don't think there are a lot of pro-Russian things. We're pro-Russian things right now. But I worked alongside Paul on the team, and that put me on the radar screen later when amazingly Donald Trump hired Paul to be his campaign manager. And I actually told my friend who had hired Paul for years that I didn't think that would happen. It's crazy, really, what's stupid. But there so I was asked to produce a lot of information in the Senate in 2017. And at the time I was working in the Czech Republic on a campaign for Cambridge Analytica. And I got a call, I was in a pub at 10 o'clock at night, quite drunk, it's very loud. And the guy said, it's Jim from the Senate. So Jim from the center,
Jim Wolf, right,
Jim Wolf,
going well.
stand up dude. Yeah. Anyway, so it's Jim from the center, told me to go home and check my email. So I went home to check my email, and there was a letter from then Senators Warner and Burr asking me to produce a list of all Russians I've ever met. I mean, there was some other extraordinary, unrealistic, and sophomore requests in the letter, but I went back and forth with the committee, and eventually we voluntarily appeared before the committee for the interview. And I submitted about 1,000 pages of documents with you, and the first, my business email at the time was the subject of interest for the committee. And I did both. I held a few emails back about purchasing some tickets to Trump's inaugural election in 2016. And the reason I held those emails back is because I saw what was happening. There was this thorough investigation that was basically looking for, it was smoke looking for fire. And, you know, I figured I was probably going to get this one. The guy who had helped me get tickets, there was no need for me. There were enough people who were going down in this process, but basically on scouts. But still, I thought, okay, if I cooperate with the TV, perhaps that would be better. And 6 months, no, 2 months later, the FBI showed up in Georgetown with a warrant from the fund. And I should have done this because I was flying back from Florida a couple of days before, and I was at the airport, and Ken Vogel from the New York Times, and he told me that Victor Vexelberg, one of the Russian oligarchs, had just been replied to this at Kennedy Airport by the FBI. And I thought, that is actually, why are you calling me telling me that he's one? Essentially, I guess, in reference. Because that's what they do nowadays. They don't care what you say, they just take your phone and your computer, and they've got everything. So then it became clear that there's something to follow. We had to shows that people were set. My crime was failing to register the foreign agent under the foreign agent registration in 1938 for the work that I've done for aid and that work consisted of drafting some documents that were placed in American media and asking some friends to see that my father was. And one of those things that actually came in the sentence, and his boss against my wishes, wrote a letter that had come back to the party. I didn't see the party. But anyway, I had technical regulations in the U.S. I think they're in 56 and 55. If we look at some of the other federal charges that have been bandied about in the streets, it puts it in some context. I think it will be cooperated. You know, because I didn't see it not to, if your country is following it. As my lawyer put it, you have a chance to be in Team USA. So the presumption then is, well, we're in the country, we're Team USA. So as an act of faith, if they was about in the United States, it's Team USA. So sign up for Team USA.
So why don't, thank you for that. Why don't you reach for your expert and we're going to say, geez, and then
Go back to more cheerful times in the past.
you can read your sense. I particularly like the one that occurred in the Monaco, but anyway. I'm curious how many violent speak.
Get a little bit of two.
So you're giving them the interpreters.
Usually, yes, and it's always going to be with interpreting questions of decision. Unless it's short. This is this is chapter 3, and this is about halfway through the chapter. Almost half the work I do every day happens before we go to the office, which is on the block away. Often our lives still going, clean up whatever email chunks that bubbled up while I was asleep, and start charting the day. The first call to prayer is a good time to get coffee because none of the drivers are dollars in the kitchen. Then I take a shower and shave, and I'm running a razor up my neck and the kicks. First, it's just a big crowd. Walking in the bathroom's little window, sandglass and glass. You could feel the force in a big way, fortunately blocked by imminent concrete walls which hold. Then there's the tinkling of glass falling everywhere to the stone floor. Then Ali, the houseboat whom Ron had brought from the Alhama Hotel with us, starts to wail. Ali lives in the wall, a rather small structure is attached to it, and that absorbs most of the glass in the more of the glass in the house. Look for a towel, I'm naked. Mrs. Jones said to me. Careful in where I place my feet, I look into Patrick's room next door to see if he's okay, but he's not there. Then, next door to my own, water is everywhere. The force of the bomb pushed the contents of the swimming pool through the French doors and fought on the room. I pick up my laptop out of the public closet and place it on higher ground and dry out while finding the boots, a pair of shorts, and sugar. Amazingly, no one, not even Ali, is seriously hurt. After we check each other out and wait out a potential second storm as the Patten compound attack, we pack our things. The blast changes how we live in the next couple of weeks, but not what we do. The president of our calls on Ron's phone to say how worried they are and how much cleaning up the woman's have to do. I hang up. Lazar and I sweep the kernels of broken glass off the pool table and play one last round before decamping to the media center. The office becomes our new home, and I will now sleep on their desks. The aftermath of this storm changes everything. By this point, our expatriate staff had grown to over a dozen normal actors, but most were sent to a moment for the questions about how this happened to be sorted out. The one I'm sad to see though is Sarah, a beautiful young lady, young Iraqi American, who I've been trying for the sake of my long distance marriage not to notice. It also shatters the strange sense of normalcy into which we've settled. Together with me in the remaining handful of failed students, a monkey I bought as a gift for our office manager, whose father made her return also lives in the media center. We pull off the talk show we producer the next day, filming it in the convention center within Green's out. Because I have a badge with escort privileges, one of my duties becomes fetching our guests Southland's Gate checkpoint to welcome them to the set. One of these is the nuclear scientist who fled Iraq rather than put Saddam leapfrog the service. His name is Hussein al-Sharastani. As I'm walking Dr. Sharastani past the same senator, who's now seen me come back and forth a number of times, the curious infantryman asked me what on earth I'm up to. Making a talk show, I tell him, for the election. Election we saw. Why don't they just choose their king so we can all go home? Dr. Sharastani gives me a sideways look and talks and I know.
Now, any questions? Sam, you can do it.
I'm just curious about Russia. Correct. And it's a little with that. Everything. And there are some of that with the guy in charge is doing the wrong things. But I wonder why the person was not too long after the her down. My question was going to be other small children and others. The solution of that. As far the golden standards.
There was the Chechen War, and the Chechen War occurred in two parts, first in the early 90s and then in the later 90s. And we can get into how the degrees of corruption and oversight of the NSC are very low. But I think the quick answer is the reason Russia wasn't interfering more in Europe early on is because they were on the back. They were trying to. And, they were struggling with so many issues, no longer with the imperial power, having to do with pensions, having to do with conversion, to more economy, having to do with the debts that were incurred, saving policies. So I think there were so many domestic considerations that it wasn't an immediate issue. I was at Peace Corps volunteer, we talked about, not a volunteer, just mercenary, Peace Corps. Almost the parallel time we were in Kazakhstan, 1994 to 2006 years of healthcare mercenary work for Peace Corps.
Which country?
Ukraine.
Oh, really?
I think there's, I've read the book, I'm most struck by listed heroes or alliances, people who you respected. Because I turned the book itself, maybe a thriller memoir. I wanted to see whether or not the book wasn't a memoir to begin with, and how good was it. And I can spell those problems after about 15 minutes after reading the style of your writing book. And then how many countries you have served and defended our country as a liberal American. As a conservative, spout liberal tendencies in countries. But back to the people that you supported, I strongly was heartened by the accounts you gave for those people, namely number one, Susan Collins and Lucky Snow were pretty good start. Can you follow up with people like the top? Well, number one, Horace Denisof, who was a human rights activist and was eventually killed in Moscow in 2005. Near the Kremlin. Yeah. And you essentially been throughout Russia. That's been a great trip. I could imagine.
Well, this was the phase, the first phase of the book was idealist. And I think when we're young, we look for heroes, even if we don't know we're looking for heroes.
Yeah.
I was thinking earlier today about the late statesman Paul Nixon, who was a once negotiated with the United States. He had over 4 administrations. And when I was a teenager, he asked me, "Who are your heroes?" And I didn't have an answer. I couldn't, who are those heroes? But I mean, heroes are people you identify in the situation. And I think in Ukraine, there are people, some countries heroes right now, but in particular, we call it Christian.
That's what I was going to mention in your description of the job in the streets of riding a bicycle, struck me out. Piles was a good one. The lines of the groups favor too. I thought spoke very well the courage and the art of mentioned the courage. They actually wrote a plan for
3-state solution.
Right. That seemed
I stole it from something. Who did I steal it from? Joe Biden. When Joe Biden was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that was the plan, the partition left. And in retrospect, it was correct.
It goes back to the first partition of the British.
The cultures that they were before.
it's hard to hear.
Yeah.
Sorry, we'll stay on track. On this, yeah, let's speak louder. So on Ukraine, what were your impressions?
Well, I wanted to ask you that too, because in the earliest stage of the book, maybe around page 30 or so, you talked with Constantine. The way it forms in the book, you could spend the rest of the night talking to custody. But I think in the long run, you need custody as a Ukrainian blood and Russian blood. We're talking about the psyche of American people who, when you come down to what you were trying to serve, what not necessarily the political check of the rest, but the people themselves. And the people themselves in Ukraine were very social, were very humorous, were very, in spite of what has happened, the horrible things that have transpired with them, the World War, the Holocaust, World War II. They've been through a lot of that. Right. But what did you decide? I didn't know many Russians. I can tell you more about Ukrainians. But what is the difference in the Russian psyche? First.
Good question. And you know what I think the answer is? I think it comes down to a belief in self. And I've never done it, but if we did research and spending per capita, per individual spending, what do people spend their money on? Ukrainians spend their money on creams, powders, cosmetics, luxury clothes. Russians do to some extent, but less. Even the richest one will skimp on these things if they don't believe they deserve it. So I think that there are two sides of the same coin. It's like they are the same. But the Ukrainian side is the brighter side, and the Russian side is the darker. And they influence each other. But I think it comes down to an individual's belief in himself. And I think the Ukrainians are strong.
Final point, you were a member of a Tom Atlantis Human Rights Commission, which year?
Well, I testified. Remember, it was congressional committee. I testified, and that was when Bill Browder, before he wrote his book. And I was on a panel to stop Bill Browder with Red Notice. And it was me and a bunch of NGO people and then Bill Browder, and we all did our little spiel. And then this guy told us incredible story, like, who is this guy? And it was Browder, and I think that must have been 2000.
I thought one of the strongest points in your career was your scathing remarks about Russia in general, and the Russian political apparatus. Were fantastic.
Well, I said it's a criminal state.
Exactly. And I thought you were a greater person than I would be at that point.
I only did that for Paul Goldman's.
I thought Boris Nemtsov might have something to do with it also. But I thought it was a very strong point. And you even wrote down the words because they were quite endearing. And really hit home and put you in certain risk of these professions.
Well, thank you for that, and also for those two names, because I think those are two names that deserve a little more attention. Boris Nemtsov, getting back to heroes, he was an early hero. I can think of him for the common his name. And Boris Nemtsov, he was the best president Russia ever had, in that he was being groomed to replace Yeltsin, and he got out of and no one, but because he was speaking proud of him, because he was too quick to say that he really thought, which is usually good. And Konstantin Kilimnik, I've written 2 articles about him, shows up in a lot. He is a bit of a mysterious figure, but I think he's a Russian Ukrainian version of himself. That's how I see him as somebody who was hustling through changing, often difficult circumstances. I think that he has divided the Philippines. I thought he wanted to become American, and then he hooked up with, when I left Moscow to go to Iraq, that's when he hooked up with Paul and he became some poncho and Paul's down together. In the back, Bill?
2 questions. I think they're probably related. First of all, would you talk about the experience of being a target? And second, what does someone with as exciting a life as you have up to your youth do for a moment?
Well, getting started.
Wait for the main line.
Talk about getting targeted. Yeah, getting targeted is sort of that's the poetic justice in the land book, I think. Because what do politicians do? They target. And increasingly now with technology, and as we try and better understand who we're talking to and how to reach them, we target different groups. So I targeted people politically, now getting targeted criminally politically. That's a different thing. An electoral politics, different kind of politics. I have a friend, and I won't say who, but this is current time. So I have a friend in Washington who's about to be targeted, and he called in and said, well, "What do I do?" And he was overthinking everything, because that's what you do when you get targeted. Particularly by somebody as powerful as the United States government, because you assume that there's really nothing that you can do, no breath you can take that won't be monitored, no phone call that won't be heard, nothing that can't be discovered. And the only way to survive being part of it, I think, in my experience, is to be completely honest. I think that the FBI and special counsel probably tried to set me up before the initial FBI visit, or no, just afterwards, because my co-conspirator on the ticket issue, they paid a visit to him as well, and he called me nervously and said, "Let's get together, we need to talk." And I said, "Okay, let's meet at Union Station." And he was obviously very nervous and more nervous than I am, so he probably wanted to walk. And I said, "Let's go outside and walk in the wind." And we did, and he said, "What do they know?" And I said, "Everything." And he said, "What should I tell them?" And I said, "The truth." And you could see Andrew Weissman in the van somewhere behind me.
Well, I would say that was actually good advice to anybody, you know, whole point is to be honest to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the cover up is usually worse than the crime, right?
Right.
So that is, but generally, if you can get something, but when you're dealing with forces of sort of nuclear power, just bigger than any. Yeah, the best thing you can do is just try and survive. And it's something that we don't know enough about in this country. I think we're beginning to learn about it more. And people in other countries, you know, if you're Israeli or you're Palestinian, you know what it is to be targeted. If you're Ukrainian, you know what it is to be targeted. It's something that we haven't had as much direct experience. But I think we're going through a process in this country, politically and legally, where we're going to do things differently in the future than we have. At least I hope. And in terms
Second
of
part of this book.
yeah, what next? Yeah, well, Rick had the answer to that. I write for the main bar, which is an online publication. You know, I do little bits of a bunch of things. One is as a cook down here at that brewing company. I work as a limo driver, as Bill knows, driven into the airport.
And the library was the one.
I volunteer in the store and down the street at the library. We do very volunteer things. But I'm figuring that out. A friend of mine gave me David Brooks' book about the second mountain, on the presumption that in life, you know, we climb the first mountain and then there is a second. It could be your loving on the second mountain. So I'm stoking this book.
And you were pretty good at Christian minister also.
Well, I'm not a minister, but I do try and prison fellowship ministry.
Yeah, you know, I think that the work you're doing is trying to sort of sell the idea of democracy and using the U.S. as an example of that. But given what's happening in this country, that we've gone through that, the House and the practice, the nature of things, how well do you think one could sell our democracy for the country?
Less. And I think the reason is we're no longer the bulls. And what I was beginning to figure out, I didn't have a lot of Republican competitors. Paul did this work, and so there were a lot of Democrats, but just as Americans together, who were our competitors. And my competitors were Israelis, Brazilians. These are people whose skills are considered in some cases more tactically applicable to places where they live. So if you're in Angola or Mozambique, why would you hire an American? You can hire Brazilians, and they've done similar things. And so there's that, but there's also the standard, the idea that the great John Luther thing about the city on the hill. It's not shining as brightly necessarily, right? And, so yeah, why would somebody pay it for something like that? So less, but still, I mean, let's not, you know, get too doom and gloom. We still are one of the biggest, not the biggest people in the world. So, you know, America is a significant country and will continue to be. in the sort of the middle part of the book, the mercenary system. One challenge I have in doing my work is there were other people doing this kind of work as a backdoor. In other words, they would get hired to go represent somebody in the country, but they weren't really there. They were essentially hired as an alternative way of thinking. So that was, that was a challenge too. It sort of girded up thought. If I were a foreign politician, and I was looking for the best expertise I could find, I think today would be at best the 50-50 things that I
But remember, that all got started with modern American campaign practices, which goes back to the 60s in the US. We've just been very effective at selling marketing. I mean, there's a difference between democracy programs that we were doing in the first part and teaching people how to organize a modern campaign and target the messaging. That's sort of falls into the marketing and advertising.
it's an advanced step in the process. And the problem is when it's not equal, and when one side has all the ability to deliver them, it's because they control the media, because they control the bureaucratic structure, what the Russians call the administrative resources, the misuse of state resources, and that. And yeah, we struggle with that too. Our tactics have gotten worse, and I think in a way that makes us less attractive too. When people see how vicious the politics are in this country, particularly how they've become in the last decade, why would I want to?
So you talked a lot about a lot of different countries and a lot of different experiences. And it seems that the Soviet Union is always sort of I love that picture because it's the Kremlin is always sort of in the smoky, misty background. But there's one huge power that you haven't even mentioned, and I haven't read the book yet, but what about China?
Well, getting back to democracy, while we're pulling back on democracy, the People's Republic of China has set up something called the Confucius Institute. And the Confucius Institute, the biggest one is in India. They train people in these other countries. Forget about that silly democracy stuff. This is how a proper state runs. And so they're bringing officials to China and training, and all sorts of other cross-fertilization processes are happening there. I don't take it. This is, first of all, I don't have a lot of experience. I didn't have. Kazakhstan is in the neighbor of China, Russia is in the neighbor of China, and then but I really don't know about China. I don't understand China the way I understand Russia. Other than the fact that it's an enormous threat to our liberal values, and that they are actively extending influence in a way that the West has been supposed to do.
You were in ERC, right?
Yes.
Chinese, everything.
And you know what somebody told me was that we like them better. And we like them better because they come upriver and they live in our villages. They sell us their crap, but they live with us.
And they build buildings and they fix infrastructure and.
Yes, but on loans that, when we look at it, who's building it? Are they using African workers? They're flying in their own. So at least somebody will stand up for them. They're not creating jobs. Wherever they work, they're flying in their own feet. So the money's all going.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yeah. I think that's the next big question. I'd like to China, something like that. It is obviously the major dominant player.
It's the elephant in the room.
And more part of our daily lives.
But if we have time for one more question and then, you can have people come up and sign the book. After they pay for it.
Oh, yeah, if anyone wants a book, I'm happy to sell you one in the parking lot. This is a non-profit organization. I don't want to track it. They're trying for.
Before I read the book, the notion of promoting democracy, I had no idea what that meant. But I found it was also the specific, when you arrive in the country, people have no idea how to organize a campaign or to shape a message. When you talk about writing speeches to the people and all, like specifics, you're not saying in the US, you're this way, you're saying who do you want to reach, and this is how you do it. And you just name some of the nuts and bolts and things that you did, like how is one of the voting democracy plan.
Yeah, I read a story when we got to Russia about somebody who had been there before, not with IRI or NDR, but had just gone over. As Americans do, sometimes when people who show up in places like Prague or transitions and things that were happening. And this guy had gone to work for the gubernatorial team outside Moscow, as they call it, appointed himself to the office. And he wrote a speech, Sonny Reagan a speech about morning rush and how everything was going to be better and hope is just around the corner and so forth and so on. It's very proud of the speech, and he had his candidate deliver the speech to a group of country people somewhere else in the staring at him. And he got back in his car to Moscow and he asked the driver, "What do you think of the speech?" And the driver said, "I think it was stupid American speech." The guy was a little hurt. He said, why did you do that? Because you made candidates lie. Everybody things will only be worse. You made them lie. And I thought, interesting. tough audience. So I mean, the first thing you start out with is research and getting an understanding of who you're talking to. So polling focus groups, if you can afford that, if there's money, polling costs and $100,000. So there have to be resources. If you don't have those resources, just studying past election results, data analysis, census data, voter loyalty, any other organization that civil society. And then you start identifying pockets of people. You think that everybody on the grid, and you have the people who are closest to you, who support you very much. And then you have people of varying degrees of support who might support you, who consider supporting you, who don't think they'll support you, who really don't think they'll support you, who hate your guts, who will never support. And every person in the world lives in this way. So you start plotting people on where they are in the grid and start thinking about how you can do it. How can you start pulling people from over here in the direction? And then when you know what your strategic aims are, who it is that you want to follow. Whether maybe all you're doing is you're talking to your really good friends and saying you're really going to get out of the because that's the best. You know that's the certain things. Maybe you'll be a little more ambitious. I remember when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, there was he did a photo op with Trump. He went to shoot. And that was interesting because obviously he wasn't big before the Second Amendment laws. So he was essentially fishing in his opponent's pond. He's over here in this side, and he could only be over here because he already secured it. So it was a sign that he's strong enough because his own forces were strong enough that he could start trying to pull people in. Our problem today in politics is that the core is not strong enough. They're always reinforcing the core, and we stop the study.
I understand that in our picture. So what you're trying to do is let people wherever you are see that they need to tailor the message to reach people that they want to reach. And I thought you're rewriting one and see people and then I'm getting into my design.
Well, just remember, there's a distinction between democracy building foreign aid programs and campaigning techniques that he's referring to.
Right, so I thought. They were the examples.
Well, we did do campaign training under USAID funding program.
Generic.
Generic.
So, anyway, thank you very much, Dan. It's an interesting book.
Thank you to the library for having us. I think there's some donation material.
And those that haven't had it, is a good reading.
That's coming from my high school.
He's responsible for